Okay, welcome to this deep dive. We've got quite a stack of material here you've shared.
Yeah, it takes us through some really fascinating and honestly sometimes pretty wild topics.
Absolutely. We're looking at everything from, serious government responses to major fraud.
All the way to how public money is spent, and even some, well, surprising debates in entertainment and media.
It's quite a range. Political actions, spending patterns, media critiques, cultural representation. It's all in there.
So our mission today is basically to pull out the key insights, the facts, the arguments from all this material you sent over.
Right. We want to give you a clear picture of what's going on in these areas, even if they seem totally separate at first glance.
And digging in, you really find some surprising details, maybe even kind of absurd stuff you wouldn't get from just headlines.
Definitely. Let's get into it.
Okay, so we're starting with something pretty serious highlighted in the sources, a big fraud scandal.
Right. Involving illegal deductions from retirees' benefits. Money improperly taken from INSS payments.
INSS being Brazil's National Social Security Institute. And the scale reported in Metropols. It's huge.
Over $2 billion in illegal discounts in just 1 year.
Exactly. And the source notes this whole thing was impactful enough to get the INSS president and the Social Security minister at the time dismissed.
Wow. But what's really striking, looking at the material, is what the government did next about the victims.
Yeah, the AGU, that's the government's top legal office for the current administration, went to the Supreme Federal Court, the STF.
And they asked the STF what? To suspend the lawsuits?
That's right. Suspend lawsuits filed by the actual victims of the fraud. The filing date mentioned is June 12, 2025.
Okay, hold on. So the people who had money illegally taken are being asked to pause their legal fight against the system.
And this is where the AGU's reasons, as laid out in the source material you shared, get really interesting.
What justifications did they give?
Well, the material mentions a few things. One claim is they need to unify court decisions. They argue some orders for double compensation for victims are illegal.
Double compensation.
Yeah, and they also argue INSS administrative stuff isn't covered by the Consumer Defense Code.
Which is important because that code often requires double compensation when consumers are harmed, right?
Exactly. And then there's the big one. They want to avoid mass litigation.
Mass litigation, meaning too many lawsuits.
Right. The argument presented is that a flood of lawsuits could hurt the government's budget security and maybe even the sustainability of Social Security policies.
So they're worried about the cost of making things right for the victims.
That's the stated concern. But the critical perspective in the source material, well, it pushes back hard.
I'll go.
It argues the government and INSS were negligent, or maybe even helped the fraud happen in the first place.
And the sources also criticize the fact that the government doesn't seem to be going after the actual fraudsters who took the $2 billion.
Precisely. And the material challenges the idea that double compensation is illegal, suggesting the law actually requires it here.
So the tone in the source is pretty sharp then.
Oh, yeah. It implies the government's move isn't really about unifying decisions or budget concerns, but more about dodging responsibility.
Avoiding the full legal consequences, like paying double compensation and potentially moral damages.
That's the suggestion, and the budget argument gets slammed too.
How?
The source material kind of mocks the idea that paying the victims would crash the economy. It suggests that would mean printing money, causing inflation.
Which harms everyone, especially the poor.
While the actual thieves just keep the billions, it points out this perverse outcome where the public pays twice, first as victims, then through inflation.
That's a powerful critique. Anything else on this specific case?
Just a couple of notes from the sources. The case might go to Minister Dias Toffoli at the STF because of related cases, what they call prevention.
Okay.
And maybe the most startling bit, the material reports the government is allegedly asking victims to return the illegal deductions, possibly starting next month.
Asking the victims to return the money that was stolen from them.
That's what the source reports, suggesting it looks like they want to continue robbing the victims. It's quite a claim.
So wrapping this section up for you, the listener, why does this matter? It really hits on core issues, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Government accountability, how vulnerable citizens are protected or not protected.
How public money is handled, and whether the legal system is fair when things go wrong on a massive scale.
It makes you ask who the system prioritizes when this kind of fraud happens. The victims.
Or the institution involved.
Okay, let's shift from that major financial issue to some other examples of public spending highlighted in the sources, this time focusing on media and culture.
Right. One story that pops up is about TV host Cissa Guimarães on TV Brasil.
That's the public broadcaster run by EBC, funded by taxpayers.
And the source details a pretty big salary bump for her there, from our $70,000 a month
to our $100,000 a month.
Wow. Now, the criticism in the sources is, well, blunt. This raise is taxpayer money, but her show, Sem Censura, reportedly gets really low ratings. Less than one iBuy point the material specifies. That's very low audience share.
And the analysis in the sources connects this raise, despite the ratings, to her perceived political alignment described as left-wing and her connections.
It mentions her show featured figures like YouTuber Felipe Neto and the First Lady Janja.
Yeah, and the source uses some sarcasm, suggesting being left-wing is getting expensive for taxpayers. It also briefly mentions Bolsonaro's old promise about EBC.
Okay, another example from the sources involves public money for cultural events, but this time from judicial bodies.
The STJ, the Superior Court of Justice, and the STF, the Supreme Court again, sponsored a music festival.
A music festival, sponsored by courts. For what?
It was for World Day of Cultural Diversity. But the critique in the material asks, why are courts funding music festivals?
Isn't their job the legal system?
That's the point raised.
Yeah.
The source frames it as a trend and makes sarcastic comparisons to politicians using public funds for events with specific artists.
Often artists seen as left-leaning. It mentions Maria Gadu and Diogo Nogueira, noting they make the L gesture.
Right. So the takeaway here for you, the listener, based on these sources, it's about questioning how taxpayer money gets used by public institutions.
Questions about transparency, potential political favoritism, and funding cultural stuff.
Exactly. How are these spending decisions made, and are they the best use of public funds?
All right, let's completely switch gears now. This next topic from the sources is, well, pretty unexpected. It's about inclusive dubbing.
Yeah, this whole debate, as presented in the material, seems to have started with an argument about the character Hiccup from How to Train Your Dragon.
The character who loses a leg in this story.
That's the one. The argument highlighted was that Hiccup should ideally be voiced by an actor who is actually an amputee.
Why? What was the reasoning given in the sources?
The argument, as summarized, was about tackling prejudice and lack of opportunities for amputee voice actors. It called for, affirmative action or quarters in dubbing.
Okay. And how did the sources cover the reactions to this?
Well, they highlight a lot of critical reactions and counterarguments. The overall tone reported is often one of disbelief, even ridicule.
Like what kind of reactions?
Well, one immediate, maybe slightly silly reaction mentioned was asking, does a dragon character need a real dragon voice actor?
Okay, a bit facetious. What about more serious points?
A big part of the critique presented focuses on inconsistencies.
Such as?
Like, the actor playing Hiccup in the live-action movie isn't an amputee, and the animated character only loses his leg late in the story anyway.
And the Brazilian voice actor, Gustavo Pereira.
Also not disabled, according to the source. So the core counter-argument that comes through strongly is about the nature of voice acting itself.
That it's about talent, interpretation.
Exactly. That it's about using your voice to embody a character, and it shouldn't necessarily be about matching the actor's physical traits or identity to the characters.
Did the sources give examples of this?
Yeah, they mention well-known Brazilian examples, like Márcio Simões, a white actor who's voiced black actors like Morgan Freeman and Samuel L. Jackson for years.
Well, Marco Antonio.
Another white veteran dubber. The source notes he's voiced Jack Sparrow, Brad Pitt, George Clooney, even a drag queen in Priscilla. The point being made is that voice actors can and do portray characters very different from themselves.
The material also mentions a specific controversy about Marco Antonio.
Yes, a claim, presented as controversial in the source, that he was allegedly replaced on a job because he was heterosexual and the character was gay.
And this was used in the source to suggest
hypocrisy or inconsistency in some of these inclusive demands, according to the perspective presented.
So the general feeling in the sources towards these specific demands is quite negative.
Very much so. Strong disbelief, questioning where the logic ends, like only a bald actor for a bald character. The suggestion offered is that these are invented causes.
So why should you, the listener, care about this debate?
Well, it touches on big questions about representation in media, right? What does it mean? How is it best achieved?
And the balance between an actor's talent versus their identity in casting. Plus, the potential impact on the art form itself if certain rules were applied broadly.
It's a complex discussion about creativity, identity, and opportunity.
Okay, let's circle back now to some of the broader political and economic themes from the source material.
All right, there's some media analysis discussed, specifically a Globo News segment looking at an IPEC poll.
IPEC, one of the big Brazilian polling firms. And the poll showed
58% of Brazilians don't trust President Lula.
and the reaction in the sources to the analysis of this poll.
Quite mocking, actually, finding the analysts' conclusions like, this is worrying for the government and good for the opposition, to be incredibly obvious, like stating the bare minimum as insight.
Okay, then the sources present a clip of Lula speaking.
Yes, and they analyze that. In the clip, Lula talks about government spending.
How does he frame it?
He calls spending on the poor gastos expenses, but spending on the rich investimento investment.
That's a very specific framing.
It is. He also claims the rich don't pay taxes, though the source adds a note about the Rouanet law and our $50 billion. And he mentions it seems like a damned fate for the poor to always be poor.
And how is this speech analyzed in the material?
Critically, it quotes the Globo News analyst calling it Manichaean, black and white and outdated, like from 1989, and alarming.
Alarming in what sense? Does it connect to economic policy?
Yes. The sources and the analyst link it to perceived fiscal irresponsibility. They note that economists, even developmentalist ones like Haddad, Gallipoli, Manteiga, Beluso,
Reportedly warned Lula about fiscal problems over a year ago.
right, which apparently irritated him, and the consequences of this approach, according to the source material.
What did they say?
That it ultimately hurts the poorest people the most, mainly through inflation.
Because inflation hits low-income earners hardest.
Exactly. It also discourages business investment, adds to the national debt, and damages the economic team's credibility. The sources basically say this account won't close. The numbers don't add up long term.
And is there a political interpretation offered in the source material?
Yes, there's an interpretation linking this fiscal approach and the rhetoric to a strategy.
What kind of strategy?
The idea presented is that maybe the government wants the poor to stay dependent on benefits, maybe less educated.
So they keep voting for a particular party. That's a very pointed critique presented in the source.
It is. So understanding this part is important for you, the listener, because it helps in analyzing political language.
Seeing the potential economic fallout from policies and recognizing how these big issues like inflation or debt can actually affect your daily life, your job, public services.
Definitely. So we've really covered a lot of ground here, pulling from all those varied sources you provided.
Yeah, from government actions on fraud and the legal system.
To critiques of public spending and media and culture, analysis of media analysis itself.
Debates on representation and critiques of economic policy and political rhetoric. It's quite the mix.
And looking closely like this, digging into the details and different viewpoints the sources offer, really helps connect the dots, doesn't it?
It does. You see things you might miss otherwise. It's, like you said, a shortcut to being more informed on these complex things.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. When you take all these different points raised in the source material together.
The government's handling of the fraud victims, the spending patterns highlighted, the media analysis critiques, the arguments over inclusive dubbing, the economic debates.
What do all these seemingly separate issues presented through these sources collectively tell us? Maybe about the current state of public conversation or governance, or even just what society seems to value right now.
Yeah. What larger picture emerges? What questions do these sources leave you asking?